Hello students, how are you? Welcome again in my lecture. Today I am going to explain the next part of the pollination, that is outbreeding devices. So in the previous lecture I had explained you about what is pollination, types of pollination and the agents of pollination. In the types of pollination I had explained there are two types of pollination, self-pollination and cross-pollination. The self-pollination means when the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to stigma within the same flower. But the cross-pollination is when the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to stigma of the different flower, whether they are present on the same plant or present on the different plant. So in the continuation of that self and cross pollination, I'm going to explain the outbreeding devices. So in this slide, the flowers mostly are hermaphrodite in nature. Hermaphrodite. Hermaphrodite means flower that are bisexual in nature, that are monoecious in nature. So hermaphrodite, bisexual and monoecious all are the same thing, which means when male and female structure present within the same flower. So in such type of flower, they can easily undergo for the self-pollination. They can undergo for the autogamy. So in this slide you can see this is hermaphrodite flower. It is having the male part, that is the stamen, and the female part, that is the pistil or the carpel. So pollen grain easily transfer from the male part, from the anther to the stigma. So this type of pollination is the autogamy. But when any flower continuously undergo for the self-pollination, for the autogamy, then it leads to the inbreeding depression. This inbreeding depression means ki degradation in the quality, the loss of evolution in the variety, because they are sharing the same gene again and again, so by which variation will not express in such case of pollination. So to avoid this depression, this degradation, most of the flower encourage the cross pollination. So this cross pollination is also known as outbreeding device. क्या कहलाता है? Outbreeding device. So cross pollination or outbreeding device, both are the same thing. Similarly, the self pollination and inbreeding, they are representing the same thing. Fine. So there are various methods, various mechanisms which avoid the inbreeding depression, which means which encourage the cross pollination. Number one, the first is avoiding synchronization. The word synchronization means the matching between the male and female structure, the timing between the male and female structure. So in this case, in this mechanism, the timing of the maturation of the male and female gamete is different. So which means here in this case, a pollen grain released before the stigma becomes receptive or mature. So if the stigma is not receptive, the pollen grain, then it will not lead to the self-pollination. Here in this case, the pollen grain will not get fertilized within the same flower, because the stigma is not ready to receive, not mature to receive the pollen grain from the same flower. Next thing, next mechanism, that is the arrangement, the position of the anther and stigma. So when anther and stigma are arranged in such a manner that they are not able to meet with each other within the same flower. So this arrangement also encourage the cross pollination, is also support the mechanism of the cross pollination. Now, third one, the third mechanism, that is self incompatibility. This word incompatibility means the matching, the tuning between the male and female part. So when the male and female part, the anther and the stigma, are not compatible with each other, not able to just support each other, then this is known as self incompatibility. So this self incompatibility, okay, it is genetic mechanism, right? So this mechanism is used to prevent the self pollen. So in this case, the flower must be, or it may be the bisexual, but it will not undergo for the self pollination, because here in this case the anther and the stigma are not compatible with each other. So the fertilization is inhibited by the pollen germination or the pollen tube growth, because in this case pollen not set on the stigma, and if the pollen grain will not set on the stigma, then it will not produce its pollen tube inside the female structure of the plant. Next part, the production of unisexual flower. Yes, this unisexual means if the flower is having either the male structure or female structure, then this case is known as unisexual flower, right? So if the male and female flower are present on the same plant, but the flowers are different. They are present on the same plant, no doubt. So plant is monoecious. Plant is monoecious because this plant is having both flower, but flower is dioecious. Flower kaisa? It is dioecious. One is the male flower and another is the female flower. So this production of unisexual flower, it prevent the autogamy, but it support geitonogamy, because geitonogamy is the transfer of pollen grain from one flower to another flower within the same plant. So this is the one of the condition where plant is monoecious, it is having both male flower and female flower, but flower are different. One is the male and another is the female. So it will not undergo the autogamy self pollination, but it will go for the geitonogamy. So you can see in this slide the example of the castor. So they are having the different flower, male flower and the female flower. Similarly, maize, it is having the male flower and the female flower. So flowers are different, but they are present within the same plant. So if the plant is monoecious, then it will go for the geitonogamy. But if the plant is dioecious, which means one plant is having the male reproductive structure and another plant is having the female reproductive structure, means the one of the plant is having the male flower only and another plant is having the female flower only. So in this case, the male and female flower are present on the different plant. This is known as dioecious. So these type of plant are known as dioecious plants. So this dioecious plant prevent both autogamy and geitonogamy, but it will go for the xenogamy, right? Next part in this content, the pollen pistil interaction. The word pollen is the male part. Pistil, it is the female reproductive part, and interaction, the meeting between the male and female. So pollen pistil interaction is a process in which Pistil recognizes the compatibility or the incompatibility of the pollen grain. So this is a mechanism where the pistil have a potential to recognize whether the pollen grain that stigma is receiving is compatible or incompatible, which means either it is receiving the right type of pollen grain or it is having the wrong type of pollen grain. So this stigma is a type of sensor. Nowadays, we all are knowing about the sensor. So the stigma is a sensor of the flower. So this stigma easily sense the type of pollen grain, either it is compatible or incompatible. If the pollen is compatible, right type, then pistil accept this pollen grain and promote the next event, that is a post-pollination event. It means the pollen grain easily accepted by the stigma, and now this pollen grain ready to initiate the next process, that is the post-pollination event, that is the fertilization event. So in this case, the pollen grain germinate on the stigma and it produces a pollen tube. So this pollen tube is a long tube-like structure which originate from the point of stigma. Now you can see here different pollen grains are attached at the surface of stigma. Now one of the pollen grain produces its pollen tube. Now this pollen tube through the style try to approach the ovary. So through the micropylar end it enters in the embryo sac where the female gamete is already waiting for the male gamete. So the event where the pistil interact with the pollen grain is known as pollen pistil interaction. Now, if the pollen grain is incompatible, अगर pollen grain wrong है ना, तो क्या होगा? Then the pistil easily reject the pollen grain. So in this case, pollen grain will not able to produce its pollen tube through the style because stigma is not allowing the pollen grain to set on the stigma and also produces its own pollen tube. So in this case, pollen tube growth will not be permitted by the stigma. So in plant where the pollen grains are at two-celled condition. Now, if the pollen grain is right type and stigma is allowing the pollen grain to produce pollen tube, so there are two conditions. First condition, if the pollen grain shed at two-celled condition. Two-celled condition means one is the vegetative cell and another is the generative cell. Two types of cell present in the pollen grain. So now, in this case, the generative cell divides into two male gamete. What happened? Okay, it is pollen grain having the two-celled condition. One is vegetative, another is generative. Now generative cell again divides into two male gamete. Now these two male gamete now enter in the pollen tube during the pollen tube growth. Right? Now move ahead. In the plant where the pollen grain already shed in the three-celled stage, three-celled condition. Now in this case, pollen tube already carry two male gamete from the beginning. So let's come to the difference. Okay, if the two-celled condition, then one of the cell divide into two male gamete, but if there is three-cell condition, then from the initial time pollen tube carries the two male gamete. Now pollen tube reaches the ovary and enter the ovule through the micropylar, is the gate, the entry point of the pollen tube, the male gamete. Now the male gamete enter into the ovule, into the embryo sac through the filiform apparatus, and finally the male gamete find the female gamete which are ready to fertilize and initiate the next event of the sexual reproduction in the flowering plant, that is the fertilization. So today this is all about the outbreeding devices and pollen crystal interaction. Thank you.